Purim afternoon. I'm Rabbi Ed Feinstein, and I'm privileged to welcome all of you. Going to mute everybody so we can do a little bit of learning together. So we've been taking a look at the Talmud, and it's been my intention to try to introduce you to the way that Talmud works, because I'm very interested in its pattern of thought. Last time we looked very carefully at a sugya. The name of a Talmudic section is called a sugya. The sugya that we looked at last time was a very interesting sugya that dealt with the issue of how we use language, and in particular how the community that survived the destruction of the temple reorganized itself in such a way that it could hold its communal solidarity, even though there was a great deal of contention within the community, something that I think all of us need to learn from. Last time we were speaking with Rabbi Scoff, and he offered us this wonderful theology lesson on whether mitzvot are rewarded. Today, I want to jump back into the sort of thick of Talmudic discussion, because I want to show you that what Talmud deals with is everything. The Talmud had no boundaries in terms of what it was applied to. There's criminal law, and there's civil law, and there's family law, and there's ritual rules and regulations, ritual law, and theology, and popular wisdom, and even issues of medicine and other kinds of things. Everything is dealt with in Talmud, and everything is dealt with the same analytical tools and the same literary structures. So the same sort of form of argument that we find discussed in legal texts are applied to theological texts. Today, we're going to go back to a legal text, a very important legal text, because I want to show you the boldness with which rabbinic authorities at the beginning of the rabbinic period dealt with the Bible, and the boldness with which they innovated within Jewish religion as a response to the conditions that they met. We all have this idea that religion is conservative with a small c. That is, it never changes. It's the life changes, fashion changes, morality changes, economics change, politics change, but religion is one of those areas that doesn't change. That's one of the things we sort of like about it, because you can sort of count on what you're going to hear in shul year to year. But in fact, religion changes very radically, and Jewish religion works very radically. Ellie has no sound. Why does Ellie have no sound? Can everybody else have sound? Can you hear? Yeah, Ellie, I think it's something in your computer, because I think everybody else is doing okay. If you're having trouble hearing, if you're having trouble hearing on Zoom, then try coming off Zoom and going on YouTube or Facebook, and you'll find us there and you can hear us there, okay? Okay, let's continue. So the question here is, how bold are you allowed to be? If you believe that the Bible is given by God and that our obligation in life is to observe the rules and traditions of the Bible, the mitzvot of God, the commandments of God, then how creative can we be in terms of messing with the Bible? Well, you're about to see exactly that. So let me put a screen up. Let me put a text up on the screen, and we can begin to learn together. What happened to my text? It just disappeared. Wait 1 second, please. I'm sorry. There we go. There it is. Okay, so sorry. All right, we have this law in the book of Deuteronomy. It's a law that has to do with, in Deuteronomy, we have an ethic, a ethic of sacred economics. And here's the law. Every 7th year, you will practice remission of debts. This shall be the nature of the remission. Every creditor shall remit the due that he claims from his fellow. He shall not dun his fellow or kinsman, for the remission proclaimed is of the Lord. You may dun a foreigner, but you can't do it to the people in your own family. So what does that mean? Every 7 years, all debts are canceled. You owe money on the car, you don't owe money anymore. You owe money on the house, don't owe money anymore. You owe money to the credit card company, you don't owe money anymore. How many people like this idea? Raise your hand. Really interesting idea. Now, this is what you can see how aspirational this idea is. The problem that the Bible rather is concerned about is that if people start racking up debt, a farmer has a field, so he borrows money to buy the seed to plant the field. There's a drought, the harvest doesn't come in. He has to borrow another year to buy the seed to plant the field. After a couple of bad harvests, you end up with a crushing burden of debt. A crushing burden of debt means that his family lives in poverty. Means he has to start selling his prized possessions. Maybe he has to even sell his land. Maybe even has to sell his children into indentured servitude to pay the debts that he incurred. The Bible is terrified of that kind of poverty because the Bible remembers Egypt and remembers what happened to us in Egypt. And in order to prevent anybody from having the kind of power over people's lives the way Pharaoh had over us, it creates an economic system which is highly aspirational. Every 7 years, all the debts are canceled. Torah goes on and says, there shall be no needy among you, since God will bless you, but only if you heed the Lord your God and take care to keep his instruction. For God will bless you, and you will extend loans to many nations, but you will not loan to each other. If, however, there's a needy person, so right away there's an interesting contradiction, because here it says there'll be no needy, God's going to take care of you, and here it says there's going to be needy. If one of your kinsmen is in need, in the land the Lord God is giving you, do not harden your heart and shut your hand against your needy kinsman. Rather, open your hand and lend him sufficient for whatever he needs. Beware lest you harbor the base thought, the 7th year, the year of remission is coming, so that you are mean to him and don't give him anything. He will cry out to the Lord, and you will incur guilt. Give him readily and have no regrets when you do so. For in return, the Lord your God will bless you in all your efforts and all your undertakings. There'll never cease to be needy in your land, which is why I command you to open your hand. Now, you can see the problem right away. The Bible gives us a rule. Every 7 years, cancel all the debts. And right away on the spot, the Bible says, I know what's going to happen. I know why this is going to be a problem. And then it pushes you not to make this problem, but it knows there's going to be a problem. What's the problem? The problem is if a guy comes to you in year 6 or 7, remember, the 7-year cycle is a national cycle. It happens, by the way, so in case you know that this is relevant, this year in Israel is a Shemitah year. This is year 7. The calendar is kept so that every year you know which year in the cycle you're in. It's not a personal 7 years, it's everyone has 7 years, right? So if a guy needs a loan to buy a car, if a guy needs a loan to plant a field, if a guy needs a loan to marry his daughter, to marry off his daughter, and he comes to you in year 6 or in year 7, you're not going to want to loan him any money, because if he misses a payment or two, you're never going to get your money back. And so what happens is the economy grinds to a halt in year 5 and 6 and 7. And the Torah knows this. So the Torah already comes and says, don't do that. God will punish you. Now, if you have to be told you're being punished, it means that's what you wanted to do anyway. The bigger problem is this. This law works as long as we're a village, that is agrarian. This law works as long as much of the economy is still based on bartering. This law doesn't work the moment we move from a bartering economy, an agrarian economy, to an urban money economy. Money changes the way we do economics, because money means that I have an object with a sort of value, and that object has to hold its value, the dollar, the ruble, right? The shekel. Because if it doesn't hold its value, if it can't be lent and bought and traded, then the whole economy stops. So what happens? The Torah says, don't hold back loans in year 5 and 6 and 7, anticipating the remission of debts. Open your hand and take care of the needy. Okay. One more law in Mishna Shvi'it. Mishna is the early rabbinic law of the 2nd century. Shvi'it, as the number implies, it's the 7th year, is the laws about the sabbatical year. So in chapter 10, we have the following: the sabbatical year cancels a loan written in a document or one not written in a document. So whether you've documented the loan or whether it's a loan based on an oral handshake, the seventh year wipes it out. But now it qualifies that. It starts to qualify that. You can see why the qualifications came. A debt to a shop is not canceled. So what's the difference between a loan and a debt? Okay, I buy a barbecue from Target, and I charge it. It's a debt. I have to pay it. I have to pay it at the end of a certain period. It becomes a loan when it becomes a long-term kind of thing, when it's not due in any particular moment, but it becomes a long-term obligation. So a debt to a shop is not canceled, but if it's been converted to a loan, then it's canceled. Rabbi Judah says the debt is always canceled, even if it's a loan to a shop, a debt to a shop. So there's an argument about whether debt and loans are the same things. Okay, wages owed to a worker are not canceled, but if it had been converted to, somebody there? Wages owed to a worker are not canceled, but if it had been converted to a loan, then it gets canceled. Rabbi Yossi says the wages for any work must cease in the seventh year is canceled, but if it doesn't cease the seventh year, it's not canceled. So certain kinds of work are canceled, right? And then we're introduced a new idea. And the idea is a thing created by Hillel. Hillel was a first century rabbi. He was same time as Jesus, basically, contemporary of Jesus. A loan secured by a prosbook, that's the word, it's a Greek word. Prosbook is not canceled. This was one of the things enacted by Hillel the elder for when he observed that people refraining from lending to one another and thus transgressing what is written in the Torah, beware lest you harbor the base thought, the seventh year is approaching, so that you are mean to your needy kinsman and give him nothing. Hillel enacted a prosbook. So what was Hillel's motivation? Hillel saw that in the fifth and sixth and seventh year, nobody could borrow money. No one was lending money. And it was particularly hard on the poor because the poor need to borrow money in order to plant a field. The poor need to borrow money in order to buy goods to create in their craft shops. The poor need to borrow money in order to resell at a profit. And if the poor cannot borrow money, the poor don't have a fund where they can draw on to carry forward their economic activity. You end up crushing the poor, which is the exact opposite of what this law was supposed to be. The law was supposed to protect the poor. It ends up hurting the poor. Okay, very often, if you've ever remember Economics 101, micro and macroeconomics, anybody ever take economics in college? What's the number one rule of economics? Look at the whole system. Follow the consequences of actions, right? Because sometimes we make rules thinking we're helping people, but the way the system works is it rebounds against them. It rebounds against them. I had a really interesting talk with our city council person, Nithya Raman, who counts herself a big progressive, about what happens when you apply rent control and rent and you suppress evictions in Los Angeles. What happens when you apply rent control and suppress evictions is you think you're helping poor people by keeping them from being thrown out of their apartments. In the long run, what happens is you keep people from building new apartments. Because if I can't charge a reasonable rent, and if I can't throw out a renter who doesn't pay their rent, there's no reason for an investor to invest in an apartment building. Economics 101. Same thing happens to Hillel. The law that was supposed to protect the poor ends up rebounding against them. It hurts them. So what does he do? He creates a thing called a prosbook. What is a prosbook? Take a look with me, please. This is the formula of a prosbook. Prosbook is a decree. It's a document. I turn over to you, so-and-so, judges of such and such a place, any debt that I may have outstanding. I shall collect it whenever I desire. The judges sign it or the witnesses sign it. Okay? So what is it? Well, remember that the law of the Torah says that in the 7th year, the creditor shall remit the debt. In other words, the creditor shall wipe away the debt. And the court agrees that in the 7th year, the court will no longer enforce the debt. So if the creditor comes in year 8 and says, Doug Workman borrowed money from me in year 7, and I want the money back, the court will say, sorry, that's the Shemitah year, the 7th year, canceled your debt. Douglas does not owe you the money. We will not enforce the debt. So I'm out my money. But here's what the Prosbo does. The law that says you will remit debt applies to individuals. It doesn't apply to corporations, and it doesn't apply to the court. So what I do is take the debt and I give it to the court. Now the court holds the debt, right? And what is the court going to do? The court's going to enforce the debt, even after the 7th year. And then it's going to remit back to me the money that it owes me. So by turning over the debt to the court, I can pass the 7th year and the debt still stays in place and the money is owed back to me in the 8th or 9th or 10th year, whatever the contract of the loan called for. And in that way, I'm not afraid to lend you money in year 5 or 6 or 7 because I know there's a way of getting it back after the 7th year. Everybody understand that? All right. Any questions about that so far? I mean, for the lawyers, this is easy. And for the rest of us, this is a little strange. Okay. Any questions so far? Let's see. Arthur and then Douglas, please. You have to unmute, sir, if you would, please.
Just an observation, in today's world, I mean, this is nice and idealistic, but in today's world, if a landlord has a tenant under all the current issues with COVID that doesn't pay their rent, the courts right now will basically, if it comes to an eviction, the courts will, basically allow for eviction, but then all of the owed debt for as many months as the tenant hasn't paid will be forgiven. This is the way the courts are managing it, and in a way, I don't know if it's any more or less just than what you just mentioned in Talmudic law.
Really interesting question. I mean, so the question is then is given the fact that housing is hard to find in Los Angeles, if you get thrown out of your place, even if the debt's canceled, is that a worse punishment? It's a really interesting question.
Yeah,
Douglas.
Well, actually, for the landlord, though, the more important thing is getting the unit back so they can get it back into the hands of a rent-paying tenant.
Yeah.
agreed. But
And
the debt never gets
you find that most of the time, the landlords, yes, they want their money, and yes, they want what's owed, but the most important thing is getting it back into a rent-producing item.
Okay, good.
But the question or comment that I have with you, in American law, judges are supposed to interpret the law.
Right.
They are not supposed to, come back and rewrite the law so that it's in effect legislated.
Well,
So
we're about to confirm a Supreme Court justice, and that's going to be the substance of most of the conversation, I imagine.
well, we can go through, where is it legislating and where is it not? And
Right.
there are arguments about what people make about that.
Right,
But the
exactly.
problem is, you do have the ability to go back to a legislative body and say, change this.
Yes,
You don't like it, you can change this.
right.
Now you've got law in Judaism, which is immutable in some, because it's presumed to be divinely revealed.
Correct.
So you can't change it. So all you have left is to reinterpret it in order to rewrite it.
Well,
Because it was a dumbass law in the first place.
you have it's not that the law is immutable. It's that you don't have a mechanism for legislation. I mean, technically, although Congress is now frozen, technically, if you don't like a law, you can go back to Congress and pass a better law, right? If Congress stepped forward with a law that, for example, said abortion is legal under all circumstances, right? And now I'm sure it would be challenged in courts all over the place, but that would be the law of the land. The problem is can't pass anything through Congress right now, right?
well,
So
right now, an issue like we're discussing in California is biased in form, in terms of the renter. Whereas if you're in Arizona, it's switched around, or Nevada, it's the other way around. So, there's no unanimity, in interpretation.
But there's no mechanism for legislation, except there is one. And that's what we're about to see. Okay. And the legislation, there's no official. So what we use is rabbinic courts have always used much more aggressive interpretive tools in order to, as it were, legislate, although with the fig leaf of that this is all based on a verse. Here you have Hillel doing something a little more radical. So there is a mechanism in Jewish law. There's actually two. It's called a takana. A takana comes from the word tikkun, meaning to repair something. And it's what happens when the law has unintended consequences that are pernicious. Then rabbis will sometimes take the authority to change the law for the purpose of the spirit of the law. You're changing the letter of the law to accomplish the spirit of the law. And that's exactly the logic of Hillel's Prosbo. Okay, so let's take a look. We are in Mishna Gittin now, right here, okay? And Mishna Gittin, Gittin means divorce law. So the context of this Mishnah is different different laws about divorce. So here is the Mishnah we're dealing with. A widow can collect payment of her marriage contract from the property of orphans only by means of an oath. Okay, so let's say Reuven was married to Sarah, and Reuven and Sarah dies, and Reuven has 10 children with Sarah, and now Reuven marries Rebecca, much younger and much cuter than Sarah. Okay, and Reuven dies, and she has a ketubah. She is owed a certain amount of money. The heirs to Reuven, the 10 children from Sarah's marriage, are obligated to pay her, okay? They have to pay her the amount of money that's listed in her ketubah, even if they don't like her, even if she's young and cute. They have to pay her, okay? But the rabbis imposed upon her an oath, and the oath was to make sure that she hadn't already collected it, that she hadn't already sort of spirited away in her private property that much property. So the rabbis of the Mishnah say she can get her ketubah, that amount of money, but only after she takes an oath, okay? But the courts refused to allow her to take this oath, right? The courts decided that's untoward. That's not nice. Rabbi Gamliel, the elder, instituted that she should take any vow that the orphans wish to administer, and then she can collect it. So the majority of the rabbis said no oath. Rabbi Gamliel said she needs to make a vow. Okay? And the reason for this is because it's a takana. It fixes the law. Here's another takana. Witnesses signed their names on a bill of divorce, even though the bill of divorce is valid without their signatures, for a takana. We want to make sure that a divorce is actually happening, so we force witnesses. So there are these adjustments to the law based on the rule of takana. And then, as long as they're talking about interesting takanot, Hillel instituted the Prosebook based on a takana. Okay, what's the takana? The takana was the purpose of remission of debts was to protect the poor, but in fact, remission of debts is destroying the poor. So in order to achieve the spirit of the law, we have to change, and in this case, abrogate the letter of the law. Everybody get that? Now comes the Gemara. Here we get into the Talmud. Everybody buckle your seatbelt. Okay? It's the Mishnah taught, Hillel instituted the Prosebook. We learned there in Mishnah Shvid, if one writes a Prosebook, the sabbatical year doesn't cancel the debt. This is one of the matters that Hillel instituted because he saw that people were refusing to lend to one another around the time of the sabbatical year, and they violated the law of the Torah, saying don't hold base thoughts in your hearts. So he arose and he instituted the Prosebook so people would lend to the needy even in the later years of the cycle. And this is the essence of the Prosbo. I transferred to the court my debt. So now the Gemara begins with a question. In astonishment, mi ika dame de miaraisa. Does this mean that the Torah's law, the sabbatical year, cancels the debt, but Hillel instituted that it does not cancel the debt? So what's the question? The question is, are you kidding me? He erased the law from the Torah? What the, I can't say the next word. What the heck give him the right to erase a law from the Torah? It's an explicit law. What gives a rabbi the right to come along and say, you know, the law, the Torah says lobster is not kosher, but I'm telling you that on Thursdays, lobster is kosher. Where does he get off thinking he has this power? You have to hear the astonishment in the question, right? And really the substance of the question is, what gives him the power to erase a law from the Torah? And the answer is the following, right? Abaye, who is a fourth generation Amora, fourth generation rabbi, says this applies to the sabbatical year in our time. And it is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, who was the great codifier of the Mishna, who taught the verse, this shall be the nature of remission, every creditor remit that which is due from his fellow. This verse speaks of two kinds of remission. One is the release of land, and one is the cancellation of monetary debts. Since the two are equated, they're together in the Torah, right? One can learn the following. At the time when you release the land, when the Jubilee year is practiced, you cancel monetary debts. At the time when you do not release the land, such as now, when the Jubilee year is not practiced, you do not cancel monetary debts. And the sages instituted this despite the ruling that the sabbatical year still cancels debts in remembrance of the Torah mandated sabbatical year. Okay? So now everybody follow the logic. The Torah juxtaposes two kinds of remission, two kinds of canceling. It cancels debts and it cancels property ownership in the 50th year. Only when we own our own land, when it's under Jewish auspices, can we have the Jubilee year, which cancels ownership and everybody goes back to their own house. And only in that time do we have the cancellation of debts. In other words, the biblical cancellation of debts is not working anymore. It's not in force anymore because we don't control the land, the Romans do. So wait a minute. If the biblical cancellation of debts doesn't work anymore, why did we need the Prosbo altogether? Because the rabbis reinstated it, even though the Bible doesn't demand it. The rabbis reinstated it so that we wouldn't forget about the sabbatical year. So what he's saying is that the idea of the cancellation of debts is no longer a biblical law, which you can't change. It is now a rabbinic law, which you can change. It's not a biblical law, which you can't change. It's not God's law. We made it up. Why? Because the biblical law is not happening anymore. We decided to add this as a stringency. We added this as a stringency. Okay? Can I give you an example of this? Let's step back a minute and talk about the systemic example. The Torah says that on Passover, you're not to eat any leaven. Leavened grains. You can't have wheat, oat, barley, and if they get wet, you certainly can't have them because they're leavened, right? Where did we get the idea that beans and lentils and legumes are not kosher for Passover? That was a rabbinic extension of the biblical rule. If it's a rabbinic extension of the biblical rule, it can be undone. And a couple of years ago, the rabbis in Israel, and now more and more rabbis in America, are undoing it and saying you can have green beans, you can have peas, you can have legumes, because it never was a biblical law. It was always a rabbinic law. What they're saying here is that the biblical law of the cancellation of debts is no longer in force. The reason it's still practiced is because of the rabbis. And if it's practiced with the rabbis, Hillel, who is one of the greatest of the rabbis, has the power to undo it. Okay, Andy, question.
I'm I'm like blown away by this, because this is actually answering a lot of questions of like how I was taught certain things. So because this reinstitution of the sabbatical year was brought on by us, not by the Talmud, is that why when counted, it's not actually on the calendar, it's more on the time of the contract? I've heard where this was more on later times where and I'm saying this because my grandparents told me this story of how they were able to get a cow, or their parents got a cow, because the seventh year it was given, they still owed money, but the man said, you paid the cow is yours, you own the cow.
Paid
And I
off
was
the
like,
cow.
but that was that story. And I'm like, was it because he was nice? He goes, no, it's the sabbatical year. I said, but the sabbatical year is on a calendar. And they go, no, it's 7 years. So
No.
you have 6 years to pay the debt. The seventh year, whatever's left was wiped off.
You were right. They're wrong.
Okay.
They told you above them, Isa.
Okay.
It probably was a sick cow, and that's the reason the guy didn't want it back, right?
But the other thing I find interesting is how we're with the stories that I'm told now also about, like you were just mentioning Passover, the reason why I was told we don't eat certain beans and stuff like that was, and I was actually shown this, things that look similar to those things. We don't want to confuse you. And I raised my hand saying, well, if you told me I can eat this, but not that, why is that a problem for me? And they were explaining, you're educated, Andy. At those times, people weren't. They weren't as educated. So we had to make it as simple as possible. So you had to show them you couldn't do that. So they would come to us. The same way as like they were talking about in Egypt, only the educated were ones able to write. And then you had people that like squires that would read it out. And that's how they were able to pass it along. So now I understand why all these rules are being made. So it's not so much a question, but it really does answer a lot of questions that I had.
The first part of your comment is exactly right. The rabbis instituted a ban on what's called kitniot, which are legumes, even though they're not really hummus, but because they look like hummus. If you look at a grain of barley and you look at a lentil or a grain of rice, you could make a mistake and eat the wrong thing. So they banned all kinds of things that looked like grains, even though they weren't grains. But that's a ban that came from rabbis, not from the Torah, and therefore rabbis can mess with it. They can change it if they want to. One of the best examples of this is what I said a moment ago, rice. If legumes are not kosher for Pesach, why the hell is rice not kosher for Pesach? First of all, the Torah tells us that there are 7 grains, and I don't know all of them. So it's wheat, barley, oats, spelt, rye. I forgot the other one. Rice isn't one of them. The rice didn't grow in Eretz Yisrael in the first century. So where do we get off saying, well, rice, on the other hand, is a grain. It's a seed of a grass. It's high in starch. It does ferment. That's why you have sake. You can have fermented rice, right? So it behaves like a grain. It is sort of a grain. It grows like a grain. And so we made it chumatzdik. We Ashkenazic rabbis made it chumatzdik. But in Sfarad, in the southern Jews, in the Mizrahi Jews, rice is their staple. And if you take rice out of say the Persian Jewish diet or the Iraqi Jewish diet, they will starve to death. So what the rabbis do is something really wonderful. Because they were the ones that made rice chumetz, the Sephardic rabbis made a decision. For 1 week a year, rice is a vegetable. You have tomatoes and celery and cucumbers and rice and carrots. It's a vegetable. And you say, wait, it's not we're rabbi. We're telling you it's a vegetable. See? So the idea here is that if the law is rabbinic, rabbis can mess with it. If the law is biblical, you can't. A rabbi couldn't make wheat available, but he can make rice available, right? Okay. Stanley.
Yes, I thought that the biblical kashrut was you can't boil a kid in its mother's milk, and all the lobster and other stuff was extensions that the rabbis put in. But they are also
No.
Torah.
You're not allowed to have shellfish. It says fish have to have fins and
That's the
scales.
Torah.
That's Torah. Yeah. Yeah. No, the rabbinic one is making chicken fleshik. You can't
Okay.
cook a chicken in its mother's milk because chickens don't give milk. So why are chickens fleshik? Answer, because chicken looks a little bit like veal and you could make a mistake. You could think you're eating kosher, you could think you're eating chicken and you could end up having eaten beef and you'll end up, and that's the problem. I think it's a dumb law, but I'm not in a position to fix it. Right? So that's the reason why chicken is fleshik. And why is tuna not fleshik? Because the rabbi said, okay, enough already. You take away tuna, and rabbis are going to starve to death. So this is why tuna. So this is rabbinic law. They're trying to find the answer here. Okay, David, how are you? I can't, David. For some reason, I'm not hearing you. I'm hearing a squeak. Everybody hearing a squeak?
He sounds like he's on 78.
Yeah, David, we're hearing a squeak. We're not hearing. You can put it in the chat, and I'll try to answer it. Okay, Arthur. Good morning.
Yeah, just so I'm a bit, bewildered.
Good.
with,
Me too.
With Talmudic Talmudic law and its actual in the real world of 2022 enforcement. Is it only in Haredi communities in Israel where they would think that Talmudic law, since they're as isolated as they are, supersedes any local law?
No, even in
how is
Haredi,
this implemented in our current time?
it doesn't supersede local law. It is addition to local law. So in
Right.
Israel, Orthodox farmers are either not farming their fields, they're leaving them fallow, or they're exercising a legal fiction by selling their field to a non-Jew for the year.
Now in
And they're observing the
Brooklyn,
Shemitah, but you can't observe Talmudic law as a superseding local law. That's actually a rabbinic rule is Dina de Malchuta Dina. The law of the land where you are is the law. You can't run a red light and tell the highway patrolman that the Talmud said it was okay. Or you can, but you're going to get a ticket anyway. And I can't help you under those. I can give a bracha, but I can't help you under those circumstances.
so again, this in the U.S. Like this could be enforced in some of the boroughs of Brooklyn or areas in New Jersey, but only by consent of the people that are part of a
Exactly. Only by a circle of people who agree to follow this particular tradition, and then like any other voluntary religious law. All right, David, you want to try again? No, still doesn't work. For some reason, you're doing a great imitation of Donald Duck, but I can't. All right, so let's take a look at what happens next. So, having explained that the law is rabbinic and not biblical, and that the rabbis decided to continue the custom of canceling debts, even though the Bible no longer requires it, the Talmud then asks the same question it asked a moment ago, but the other way around. The other way, before it asked, how is it that Hillel had the power to uproot a law from the Torah, right? And in a sense, what is Hillel doing when he's uprooting the law from the Torah? The debt is supposed to be canceled, but he is enforcing the debt. So he's taking money out of the hand of the lender and giving it to the borrower, even though the Bible tells him he shouldn't be doing that. But now we come along and say, well, actually, the whole institution of the remission of debts is canceled. And we put it back as a remembrance of the Sabbath. And so now the Talmud asks, so you're telling me that we're now going to take money out of the borrower's hands and give it to the lender and cancel the debt, even though the Bible says we shouldn't do that. Right? And how does the court have the authority to do that? And there's two answers. One is Abaye says this is one of those instructions where you're not actually told to do something, right? You're actually told not to do. You're actually being told not to do something, right? The rabbis are not telling anyone to violate a law. They're simply telling debtors don't pay, and they're allowing the court to refuse to enforce the debt. Rava, who is his partner, says no. What happens is that all property is actually held under the authority of the court. Any court has the power to make any property hefker. Hefker means it's ownerless. Think about the institution that we have here in America called eminent domain. I own a house, and LA and the Department of Transportation wants to build a freeway through my living room. I refuse to sell them the house, no matter what amount of money they give me. So they have a power called eminent domain to take away my house and build their freeway, which means that essentially anyone owns anything only by the authority of a court that says that they own something. And so here, the court has the power to say who owns what. And if the court says the debt is canceled, the debt is canceled. And if the court says the debt is enforced, the debt is enforced. And so the rabbis can say the debt is canceled unless you file a prosbul with us, in which case the debt is enforced. And that's the way, and that gives Hillel the power to have a prosbul. Okay. Now the rabbis turn to another question. Okay. And here's the question they're going to turn. There's a couple of more things here, but I want to jump ahead. The question was asked, when Hillel instituted the prosbul, was it for his generation alone, or was it for all generations? In other words, does a rabbi have a power to set a new rule for everybody? Or is it just for one generation and each subsequent generation can cancel it? It's an interesting question. If I don't like the prosbul, or if the prosbul isn't working the way it's supposed to work, do I have the authority? To change it? Do I have the authority to change it? Or is the rule enforced for all time? That's the question. That's an interesting question. So let's see how the rabbis go about answering that question, right? The Gemara answers, what difference would it make? What difference does it make if it was instituted for one generation for all? Either way, it's still in use, right? The Gemara explains the difference arises with regard to nullifying the prosbul. If you say that it was for his generation alone that he instituted it, then we can nullify it if we desire. But if you say he instituted it for all generations, then there's a principle that a court can only nullify an action of another court if it's a bigger court. A rabbi can only nullify a previous rabbi's precedent only if he's a bigger rabbi. And there was nobody bigger than Hillel. So the question is, could a later rabbi who is less than Hillel say, the prosbul isn't working for us, we want to go back the other way? Okay. The Gemara suggests an answer. Okay. We're going to try to interpret what Hillel meant. Tashma, which means come and hear. That which Shmuel taught. Shmuel was a first generation Amora. We write a prosbul only in the court of Surah and the court of Nehardea, as they were the primary centers of Torah study, but not in any other court. If we were to presume that it was instituted for all generations, they should be writing prosbuls in other courts. So Shmuel seems to believe that this was done for all generations because there's only two courts in the whole country that can do it. The two principal courts, right? The Gemara rejects this and says, perhaps when Hillel instituted the prosbul, he did so for all generations, but only for those courts. So the fact that it was reserved to a certain court doesn't tell me that he meant it for all generations or didn't mean it for all generations. That's nothing you can learn from that. His court was the primary court, and courts like those of Rabbi Ami and Rabbi Ashi, as they have the power to remove money from someone's possession, but not for lesser courts. Then they suggest a different proof. Come and hear that which Shmuel taught. And here's the really interesting idea that Shmuel taught. A prosbul is, and the Hebrew word is ulbana. And ulbana means an instance of judicial overreach. If I had the power, said Shmuel, I would nullify it. Now, what is he saying? He's saying there are limits. And the limit here is you can't uproot a law from the Torah. You can't do that. Even if it violates, even if it has consequences, we have to mitigate the consequences, but you can't undo a law from the Torah. And Shmuel seems to believe that Shmuel was an expert in property law. And so he seems to believe that this is that example, right? How could he nullify it? Right? A court cannot nullify the court of an action of another court except if it's greater in wisdom and number. Shmuel knows that he's lesser than Hillel, so how can he nullify it? This is what he meant. If my authority were to increase so that I became like Hillel, then I would nullify it, right? So apparently he believes that it's held for all time. It's held for all time. All right, let's stop a second. Let's take another look here. Okay, so David asked a question in the chat. You want to try again, or should I just read it? Right? Were the rabbis assigned? Whoop. Dave, want to try? You have to unmute.
I got it. Yeah, I know. It just seems the rabbis were given a very big power here, and I was wondering if that was because they were considered ethical, period.
Yeah. Look, they're guardians of God's law, and they're ultimately guardians of a society, and they're trying to create a society based on God's law. And that what they're recognizing, and I think this is why I wanted you to read this, because you see what they're doing here is so remarkable. They're saying to themselves, even if this isn't what the Torah said, this is what the Torah should have said. Because we want to create a society of a certain kind. And if it means uprooting a law in order to achieve the higher end of creating a society which is ethically sensitive and spiritually alive, that's what we're going to do. And the thing about Hillel, which is so remarkable, is that, I mean, think of the chutzpah of this guy. He says, look, this is what Torah was trying to do. But in effect, at least in our time, because we live in a money economy, it's having the exact opposite effect. It's not helping the poor, it's destroying the poor. So I'm gonna change it. So yeah, you have it exactly right. Partly because these rabbis are ethical, partly because these rabbis approach this with a deep reverence for the divinity of the text, for the divinity of Torah, right? And partially because they take upon themselves responsibility for the welfare of their people. They take upon themselves.
And there was no problem with a rabbi being less than ethical.
Well,
less than ethical.
But look at what you got here. Not less than ethical. The question is, did you go beyond the bounds of what your authority was? When Shmuel says this is ulbana, what he's saying is, this is bullshit. You can't do this. You can't uproot a law from the Torah. And it's interesting because the rabbis then hush him up. They say, no. Hillel could do it. You can't do it, but Hillel could do it, right? But the very fact that there's a discussion in the Talmud means they're testing the limits of their own authority to do this. That's what the discussion is. It's a test of the limits of their. My dear teacher and friend Jerry Danzig. I don't know how many remember Jerry Danzig. He was our executive director and rabbi in our temple here for many, many, many years. Jerry's grandfather was a great European rabbi. And Jerry, every Pesach, used to tell a story about his grandfather, which makes you cry. Here's the story of his grandfather. His grandfather was a Rav, big Lithuanian rabbi who believed in the sanctity of Torah, absolutely believed in the sanctity of Torah. Every Pesach, the shochet of the town would buy a cow and shech the cow and sell the meat to the people of the town, right? But before he could sell the meat to the town, the rabbi had to check. The shochet would check and the rabbi would check to make sure that the cow was kosher. Cow can be kosher if there are certain lesions, certain wounds on the lungs of the animal. Certain lesions, certain wounds disqualify you, shows the animal was sick and you can't eat it. Other lesions are acceptable. Anyone ever hear of glatt kosher? Glatt means smooth, means this cow never had a day of being sick in his life. This cow never sneezed, not once. That's what glatt kosher means. That's why it's so expensive. So the story is this was in the old country before they immigrated to America. It was a little poor town. And the sheikh took all the money he had in his account because he saved up money all year. Pesach is coming. He buys a cow. He shechs the cow. He checks the cow. Nebuch, the cow was sick. It has a lesion on the lungs. He can't sell the cow to the Jewish community. He has to sell it at a major discount to the non-Jewish butcher. So what does he do? He goes to the richest man in town and he borrows the fortune it costs to buy another cow. And he buys another cow and he shechs the cow. And guess what? This one also is diseased and can't be used by the Jewish community. So he gives it to the non-Jewish butcher. Now he goes to another couple of people who give him some money. And the same thing happens. He shechs the cow and he looks at the cow and the cow's not kosher and he can't use it. So finally, he borrows money from all the poor people. They prepay for their brisket, right? And now he's in debt to everybody. And he shechs the cow, and this cow isn't kosher. And the sheikh is so desperate. He goes to the rabbi, Jerry Danzig's grandfather, and he says to him, what do I do? I don't have enough money the town doesn't have enough money to buy another cow. That means there'll be no meat for Pesach. There'll be no brisket for Pesach, but it's treif. So what Jerry Danzig's grandfather did was gather 3 more rabbis, and they went at the nighttime, and they took the nevela, they took the body of the cow, and the 3 rabbis stood around and held hands, and they made a prayer and asked for divine forgiveness, and they declared the cow kosher. Because sometimes the needs of the community trump or overcome the reality of biology. And they said, this cow is hereby declared kosher. So there'd be meat for the community and the butcher wouldn't go out of business. I mean, the Prosbo is the same thing. Poor Hillel is seeing what's happened to poor farmers. And he says, I got to fix this. This is not what the Torah intended. But the idea that you can erase the spirit of a law, the letter of a law, to achieve the spirit of a law, this is what you call chutzpah. And this is a beautiful kind of chutzpah here, okay? Someone else had a hand up. Yeah, Doug, yeah.
Now apply it to modern rabbis. And the question is, where is it bend but not break? Where is it going beyond the line where they've just so radically rewritten the law that it's not there?
Yeah.
And who gets the authority and who do you believe and where is it right and where is it not?
Well, what you have in modernity is a very sad phenomenon that the traditional rabbinate, that's the Orthodox rabbis, are so worried about modernity coming in and stealing away their children. They've expanded the law in remarkable ways. The word in Hebrew is chumrah, which means new stringencies. Things that used to be kosher are now treif. Things that you never had to do before, now you have to do. They expand these stringencies because they're trying to create a fence, a wall, a protective barrier around their community to keep modernity from coming and stealing their kindlech. Right? Now, rabbis have always added protective barriers to Jewish law. I'll give you a silly example. Shabbos is a 24-hour holiday. So what the rabbis decreed is they didn't want you to break Shabbos. So you light candles 18 minutes before Shabbos starts, right? And you can light Havdalah 42 minutes after it ends, after sundown. They added a 25th hour to Shabbos to make sure that you don't violate the Shabbos, right? That's extending the law, right? Now what Orthodox rabbis have done is extend the law. They've become super conservative. That is small c, super stringent, because they're so afraid that something will compromise the purity of their halakha, right? And that becomes a terrible thing because that stifles all sorts of creativity that ought to be finding its way into the creation of Jewish law. Now, the conservative rabbinate, in some sense, a reform rabbinate, mostly conservative rabbinate, has tried to go the other way and tried to have been reasonable about adding stringencies, about taking away stringencies that didn't need to be there in order to make Jewish law easier to follow. But it's a really interesting question, right? I'll tell you what I'm struggling with right now. Can I tell you what I'm struggling with right now? There is a shortage of kosher chicken. It's not that there's a shortage of chickens. It's not that there's a shortage of slaughterers. There's a shortage of trucks. And so if you've been to a kosher butcher recently, chicken now costs what a gallon of gasoline costs, about $5.50 a pound for a chicken. Wow. Now, if you go to Ralph's, they have really good organic, not kosher chicken for about 69 cents a pound. So the difference in price is $5 a pound. And I have a lot of members of Valley Beth Shalom who are on fixed income. And I'm having, I'm not going to tell somebody eat non-kosher, but at a certain point, the law becomes an obstacle to its own fulfillment, you see? So the question is, what is a leniency that's acceptable and what is a leniency that's not? And that is a very interesting question. Is it acceptable? We expanded the role of women. That was something we saw as important. We welcomed gays and lesbians and their families. That's important. What other kinds of things? I mean, at what point do you go too far? I mean, that's the question. So this is a very good question. Stan, do you have a comment? Yeah, Stan Garber.
The conservative movement.
Stanley, wait. Stan Garber, who's right on my screen, right underneath you. Hang on one second. Then I'll get you next. Got it? Did you turn off the mute? You got to unmute there. There's a button. There you go. Okay, sir, you got it.
I find it interesting that the rabbis of the Talmud never erased a law or said that this law no longer exists. They found a way to reinterpret it. So, for example, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. It doesn't really mean that. It means there's a monetary penalty. And I think that why don't we still do that today? Or maybe we do. I don't know.
Well, the conservative rabbis believe that's what they're doing. Orthodox rabbis believe that's what they're doing too. The question is, how far do you go? And the reason why I wanted you to see this argument in the Talmud is because you can see how far the ancient rabbis are willing to go. And now you have a sense of what the boundaries of chutzpah are. So it's a wonderful question, and I dearly appreciate it. Stan Schroeder, you got the last question, then I'm going to go eat lunch.
Well, I was just going to mention that the conservative movement some years ago made swordfish kosher. There wasn't before, because they used a microscope and they saw the scales.
Yep. Yep. And if they'd only find scales and shrimp, I'd be a very happy man. Let me wish that's a Purim thought. Let me wish all of you a great Purim. Come to shul, ours or someplace else tonight, and enjoy the Megillah. Have a little glass of schnapps and think of Reb Hillel and the Prosbo, and we'll see each other in a couple of weeks. Be gesund, be well.